Okay, I'm speaking today to Kath Deves, who is a law graduate and the co-founder and spokeswoman for Save Women's Sports Australia, or Australasia, I guess. Save Women's Sports
Later, yes.
Australasia. And we're going to be talking today about a new bill in Victoria, the Change or Suppression Conversion Prohibition Bill 2020. What we're going to try to do is just give a kind of overview of what's in the bill and what it's about in the first part of the video, and then in the second part get more into why we're worried about the bill or why feminists should oppose the bill. So thanks so much for talking to me today. Maybe we can start with the question of what the bill is ostensibly doing. So why is it being hailed in the left-wing media as a good thing? And then we can kind of go from there into the bits we're more worried about.
Well, I think that the vast majority of people, including the MPs, haven't actually read the bill, including the people making commentary in the media. The main purpose of the bill, according to the legislation, is to denounce people. It actually says that. So the main purpose of the bill is to denounce or prohibit change or suppression practices and to establish a civil response scheme to promote understanding of these concepts and to investigate serious or systemic change or suppression practices. So the big concern there is that no one's paying any attention to the word denounce, which the meaning of which is to condemn or censure openly or publicly. Mm-hmm. So this bill is seeking to do that to people who might have particular opinions on what they call change and suppression practices. So in a free democracy, this is big cause for concern, but mainstream media seems to have not picked up on this.
So it's not normal for a bill to seek to denounce anything?
No, not at all. I think the terminology, the word denounce, we would more associate that with the risk of being extremist, to say with totalitarianism and fascism. Mm-hmm. Now China, Stasi Germany, denouncing was a tactic of these regimes, and here we have Victoria wanting to put it in legislation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. So from what I've read in the kind of the little news coverage there've been, people just seem to be thinking it's absolutely wonderful. Like there's this mythology, I guess, or maybe that's not fair. You can say what you think, but this idea that there's loads of religious groups trying to transition all the gays back to being straight, or doing these very invasive kind of physical attempts to change sexual orientation. Like if anyone watched Ratched, there's all the medical history, right, of trying to change lesbians back to being straight. So there's this idea that that's going on, and then the bill will stop that and prevent all this harm. Does that seem accurate to you in terms of what the bill's trying to achieve?
No, not at all. I mean, that's what they're saying in the media, but that is not what the bill is going to do when they actually apply the legislation. And I mean, the interesting point to what you've just said is with having all these archaic practices being imposed on people who are lesbian or gay, by the same token, by including gender identity, we're seeking to impose these dreadful medical and surgical regimes on people who may have confusion around their identity. So there's this sort of very odd juxtaposition going on there. But in relation to the bill, its application is going to be difficult because the definitions that they're relying on, say for example, sexual orientation and also gender identity, the definitions are meaningless the way that they've been written. Mm-hmm. So the activists on the other side have been trying for almost a decade in Australia to redefine same-sex orientation to be same gender orientation. And if they're able to get this bill through, this will be their first legislative success. But basically, they're saying that it is an attraction to or an emotional connection with another person of the same gender, a different gender, or other gender. So basically a person being attracted to another person, essentially. So it has no relevance to same-sex orientation.
I saw that in the wording, right? It was like affectional what was it, emotional, affectional, or attraction. It was like, what is it? So you could just be friends, you could just like a person with a gender identity, and now you've got a sexual orientation that can be protected under the Equality Act.
It's got no basis in observable, objective reality. It's to do with a person's innate feelings, and I think that raises a whole lot of problems when we're trying to actually legislate for what are essentially internal subjective feelings.
Yeah.
How can you prove that in a court of law? And then with the gender identity, this was even more odd. So they've worked off the Yogyakarta principle definition, which unfortunately has been enshrined in our federal legislation. But instead of saying that it is deeply felt sense, which they say in the federal legislation, they've removed that. And it's just basically a person's sense of their personal feelings about dress, name, mannerism, and personal preferences. So a person's personal sense of their personal preferences. That's which is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
I am just astonished that this has gotten through to a second reading. They did disclose in Hansard on the record that the drafting of the legislation was heavily influenced by activists on the other side, which is very clear because there's also very odd references made to things like to live authentically and with pride, broken and in need of fixing. It's just very bizarre language that I've never seen in legislation before. There is some terminology that I've also seen reflected in the Queensland legislation and ACT conversion legislation. So obviously they're going off a bit of a template.
Yeah, right. So this is
the most extreme example. Yeah.
So this is the kind of recent strategy of involving marginalised groups in lawmaking that is about them, but it's just that it's. I guess there's something interesting about taking that strategy, right? And I think there's probably some cases where we would appreciate it, like law made about women. Be great if they involve women in the consultation, but then it's just this one case of trans activists. I think there's such idiosyncrasy in the demands that they're making that they really step over into other marginalized groups in a way that I've never seen before. So it's almost like there's something good in the strategy of consulting with the groups that are affected, but it's just really going wrong in this specific case because of what trans activism is like. Does that seem fair to you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have seen in published papers in law journals in Australia where they have said in black and white that they want to do away with sex as a protected category.
Right.
Outright. They just want to erase it and they want to replace it with gender identity. But the inherent fallacy there is that gender identity is reliant on biological sex to explain it when you explain it in the federal legislation because it's contrary to your biological sex. So it just turns it into this big dog breakfast of definitions that don't make sense. They also don't define gender anywhere in the Australian legislation. Interestingly, they do define it in one of the general recommendations under CEDAW, which could have some impact at a federal level because CEDAW is enshrined into our federal legislation, where they basically say that gender is harmful stereotypes based on sex that are imposed on women. But they don't define it in our legislation here. So it's all deliberately confusing, I think. So you can't get a handle on it. So you can interpret it any way to suit your purposes, which is very dangerous, particularly when you've got a bit of legislation that is going to end up in, criminal sanctions of up to 10 years imprisonment. We have to have these definitions very clear and very objective.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Just before we move on to what the criminal sanctions are that are being proposed in the bill, do you think there's, because I guess I was thinking there's some common sense already required in how to understand like anti-discrimination protections, like the current definition in the Equality of Opportunity Act being like sexual orientation is defined as homosexuality, bisexuality, or heterosexuality. So it's like, it's a definition that covers everyone, but common sense tells us it's not the heteros that are discriminated against, it's the bisexuals and the and the homosexuals. So I guess the problem is more you can't apply common sense to a definition of gender identity in these vague terms you've just outlined, like preferences and dress, because who are the ones that are marginalized once you've just got like, oh, some preferences and some ideas and maybe some, like, is that kind of thought? So it's not so much that it doesn't like clearly define who the discriminated against group is, it's that it's like just this kind of, like you say, a dog's breakfast of all these different traits, and then it'll be really hard for the average person to say who are the ones that are actually badly off out of everyone.
And I mean, like saying, relying on things like name, dress, mannerisms. Yeah. I'm presuming that what they're referring to here is a stereotype. Yeah. So, and again, like with the radical feminist movement and the women's movement, we are trying to dismantle those stereotypes. We don't want to be restricted by sex stereotypes. And incidentally, in CEDAW, they make it, it's the element of discrimination to discriminate against women on the basis of sex stereotypes. So, and yet here they are enshrining it in legislation.
Yeah.
So,
I wonder if they're going to end up I mean, maybe I'm just trying to think, what could a sensible tribunal do? I guess they could just assume it means like atypical, and then that could roll with the time. So it's like the person who's discriminated against is the one whose preference is about dress or pronouns or name or whatever is atypical, but relative to his sex, like you say, it's all parasitic on sex, but maybe that would give some sensible way to understand what the definition is even trying to get at. I don't know.
I know, like it's really hard conceptually to get your head around, and sometimes I just sit here with my head in my hands trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, like mannerisms, it's like, oh, okay, so you contravened this bill because someone's not affirmed and supported you in your preferred mannerism. Yeah. So what is that, like hair flicking?
Yeah, but maybe
how you walk?
Yeah.
I mean, what does that even mean in practicality?
But maybe it is that, right? But it would still only make sense if it was understood relative to sex as atypical, because we have an idea, right, of what men are supposed to be like. And if you get a man with long hair who's constantly preening and whatever, like, then maybe you can discriminate against him on the basis of these mannerisms. But of course, if someone's just being a bit mean to a woman who does that's not gender identity discrimination, right? Like, she's not trans. So
they're trying to legislate for something for which it's incredibly difficult, I think, and it's obviously not working.
Yeah.
I think, with what they're presenting. And then, like, further to the bill, so there's a definition. So, you know, and then it's to do with affirming and supporting a person in their sexual orientation or gender identity.
Yeah.
So there's this positive burden being put on people. It's not that you can remain neutral.
Yeah.
It's that you have to affirm and support.
Yeah.
So that means agreeing with what they're doing.
Yeah.
And you just may not. And you may actively criticise, or you may just remain silent, but both of those positions would be contrary to the bill.
I found that absolutely astounding. Like, I've almost never seen defining not being enthusiastic as a change or suppression practice. It's like, what are you talking about? Surely it's like, I can understand that it's like the trans child goes to the teacher and says, oh, I'm really a girl. And the teacher's like, no, you're not, Bob, go and sit down. It's like, okay, that's like, no, you're not, Bob. But that's so different to the teacher just being like, oh, are you? or just, oh, well, I personally don't endorse gender identity ideology and think that Susan Stryker got it wrong, you know, like, that's...
Yeah. I was saying to Bob, why do you feel this way today?
Right.
Oh, you want to put the frozen dress on. That's fine, Bob.
Yeah, it doesn't make you a girl.
That's not a problem at all. But, you know, they have to turn around and say, oh, well, we endorse your gender identity.
Yep.
We endorse the ideology. That's effectively what they're trying to do. They're trying to set it up so they have a commission that's created under this bill where they get to actively enforce people into acquiescing to this ideology.
Yeah.
Which, as I said, I do not use these words lightly, but this is totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And it is a belief system.
Yeah.
It's an ideology, and, you don't have to believe in it. You could just remain neutral, but you can't, even remaining neutral is contrary to the bill now. So, as you said, if you have a child coming to their teacher, their doctor, another family member, and they don't affirm and support, they're in contravention.
Yeah.
And, even between adults, if you had a teenage child or you had a woman whose husband suddenly came out as trans and you weren't actively affirming and supporting, that woman could be charged under the domestic violence legislation. The parents could be. It's mind-boggling. And personal violence orders.
Yes.
Then you've got an intervention order against you as well.
Yeah. The fact that they use the example of the adult child not affirming the sexual orientation of the older parent, I thought was really telling, because we all know, I think us feminists, that what it's really about is the middle-aged man, porn-saturated, declaring himself to be a woman, and now if the adult children or the wife don't affirm that he's really a woman, they can be subject to family violence. That's what's actually going to happen in how this bill is used, right? And that is mental.
Because we've seen it happen. You take it to its most extreme, and that is absolutely what will happen. And in the UK, they refer to it as the spousal veto. For people who are transitioning and want to get their GRC. It's not that at all. It's not a veto. It just means that if your spouse comes out as transgender, you have the right to be granted an annulment before they get their GRC. And the purpose of that is for women who come from maybe cultures where divorce is a stigma. And they don't want to carry that around because of what their husband has elected to do, which makes a lot of sense. And they're not stopping that person from getting their GRC and living their life how they want. They can do that, but it just means that the spouse has a right to exit from the relationship. And this is basic contract law. Marriage is a contract, essentially. That's the history of it. And that's why we have witnesses, and that's why we have a register. So essentially what one spouse is doing is completely changing the terms of the original contract. Man and a woman getting married. And then in normal contract law, the party who's had the breach against them has the right to terminate the contract or rescind the contract, go back to the position that they were in before the contract was enacted. So they have the right to have their marriage annulled and go back to where they were before all of this happened. So instead of having anything like that here, instead we have the spouse who disagrees with it getting punished, criminally punished for not agreeing with their spouse.
It's just, I really can't believe it.
I know, and we see the trans widow stories of the brave women who actually are speaking out, and in all of my women's advocacy, all the domestic violence testimonies that I've read over the decades, some of them, what the trans widows have come forward with, are the most egregious examples of coercive control and violence that I've ever seen. It's on every level, and they're being completely gaslit and excommunicated, kicked out of their communities. It's absolutely shocking, and the fact that they're now going to be punished, but just this extra layer of punishment is just astounding to me.
I'll put in the video link a couple of the cases, because there's that recent case that Glenna did the interview with the woman about, and then there's an earlier one on Feminist Current, which I think is brilliant because she really tracks the whole history, right, of her husband starting to watch porn, this kind of sissy porn or whatever, and then going on these threads and deciding that he's trans, and if people haven't encountered this stuff, I think it'll help them to understand why this family violence provision is so terrible. Can I ask one other thing, because I think maybe it will be clarifying for people that don't know that much about what you were saying about the ideology earlier. So I think the bill obviously just assumes that there's a direct kind of analogy between sexual orientation and gender identity, right? So you can give the born this way narrative about both. There's just a fact of the matter about who's gay as a kid or who's trans as a kid, and then all of this is just designed to protect those people who we can easily pick out who they are and they know who they are. So can you just say something about what's the difference between that picture of gender identity and then this kind of ideology that you refer to, where the bill is entrenching an ideology? Is that something you...
Yeah. So with gender identity ideology, that is the belief that people can change sex, essentially, that some people are born in the wrong body.
Yeah.
And while I think I can say all feminists agree people should be allowed to present and behave how they like, if boy wants to have long hair, wear dresses, whatever, knock yourself out, that's all great. But this is trying to make the assertion that there is a biological basis for this, that sex is assigned at birth, which it's not. It is determined at fertilisation, observable in utero, recorded at birth. And it's trying to impose this idea that people can have this innate sense of self, of gender, that is contrary to what their birth sex is.
Yeah.
And that this innate sense of gender overrides what their birth sex is. And then obviously we are now increasingly starting to understand that the solution for this discomfort within oneself, particularly with children, is that they need to go on a medicalised and surgical pathway. So with the legislation in Victoria, it's entrenching that as the solution for these children who are showing up with distress about their natal sex.
Yeah.
So instead of doctors and therapists and parents being able to sit there and have an appropriate exploration of the child's feelings, because as we know, those of us who've been following the debate, we have these ROGD girls, so rapid onset gender dysphoria. They come out of the foster care system, they've had bereavement, sexual assault, issues with same-sex attraction, bullying at school, a whole host of issues, anxiety, depression, and they go online, they go onto Tumblr and Reddit, and we all know who are managing those threads. Holly could put that in the show notes. It's incredibly disturbing. And then convincing these young children, particularly girls, that the solution is that they are a boy. And then obviously they're not going to be able to do it anymore in the UK with the Kira Bell case, but here in Australia there are still gender clinics. And once you walk through those doors, it's not about having therapy as to what your problems are, looking at the underlying problems. It is all about affirmation. The gender clinic in Melbourne has been on the record in years past where they have said, we are an affirmation service. So when the child shows up, they're self-diagnosed and they're ready to go with the medicalised pathway.
Yeah, good. So because
it's deeply disturbing.
So is it fair to say, like, the main difference from sexual orientation is that because there's this whole set of ideas that are controversial built up around gender identity, which maybe explain all gender identities, but maybe only explain some. I think we can be neutral about that. There's going to be some kids who identify as trans who are not trans. And is that right? That's kind of where our worry comes in, because if they're affirmed and then they get medicalized, that creates a whole set of issues that, like if someone is affirmed as gay when they're not, there's no such issues. And there's less reason to think people are identifying as gay when they're not, because there's not all this kind of social cachet or cultural phenomenon around it. Is that a fair...
like if someone wrongly comes out of the closet and they decide a few years down the track that actually no, I'm hetero or bi, that's fine. They've not done irreversible damage to their body. But as we now know, that the vast majority of children who do have distress around their natal sex and wish to present as the opposite sex do reconcile with their natal sex in puberty, which is what the Kira Bell case was all about. But as we know, that once the children are put on the hormones, it is not a pause button. They do almost invariably proceed to cross-sex hormones, and there's no coming back from that.
Exactly.
There isn't, and the next step is surgery. And you know, these kids that are in their 20s even, who do say it's the right decision, they don't know, because their puberty was interrupted, their cognitive functioning was interrupted. And we have seen from the high-profile examples that some of them, they don't understand about sexual attraction. Some of them will be denied the opportunity to have a loving, reciprocal, intimate relationship because of what's been done to their body and their brain. Development's been interrupted. It's going to take quite a number of years, I think, for us to see the real effects of this.
Yeah.
And Kira Bell's just the beginning. Yeah.
I guess you often get people on the trans side trying to point to the low rate of detransition at the moment as though there's evidence that people like Kira Bell are in the minority and most trans kids are making the right choice. But to me, it seems like that just completely ignores the massive rise in the rate of kids reporting to gender clinics, right? Like, we're going to need to wait 5, 10, maybe 15 years to see the huge increase in the rate of detransitioners. So it's like, it's no proof at all, I think, that in the last 10 years there have been not that many detransitioners, because it's the last 10 years or so that have seen the huge increase, right?
Even less than that, like the last 2 years, 5 years, and we know with cognitive development, that part of your brain sees that, the functioning continues to develop until you're between 25 and 28.
Yeah.
So that's why with the detransition movement, it's often women who are around about mid-20s, because they start to realise that this was not the right solution.
Yeah.
For them. And then the evidence base, like as we know from Kira Bell, the Tavistock didn't follow up. They didn't keep records. So them sitting there saying, there's no detransitioning, it's like, well, you don't actually know that. Because you don't have the data. So just because the data doesn't exist doesn't mean that's not a reasonable outcome. And one of the pieces of evidence they keep relying on is something that came out of the Netherlands, I think, that did a longitudinal study, but that was a completely different cohort of people. That was men who had gone through the process as adults. This is completely different. This is children, and it is girls, and they haven't been living with this till adulthood and then decided. So you cannot rely on that as good data.
No, I completely agreed. Good. So maybe we can go on to the crimes. What crimes is this bill proposing to introduce, and who is at risk? Like, is it just clinicians? Is it just doctors? Is it like everyone? So what will happen to you if you contravene the thing, if it becomes law, and then who might end up being punished under this?
So the people who are at risk is everybody. Everybody can be captured by this. Now, the commission is being set up in Victoria, but anyone can make a report. Anyone can be captured by contravention, which I might add is contrary to our constitution. So a state-created tribunal cannot have extraterritorial application.
Interesting.
The constitution is very clear on this, so I don't know where they think they're getting their authority. But they are saying it does have to be a bit of a link with Victoria, but I think they're in very shady territory here. But they are saying the people who could be at risk, and it can even be over the internet. So it could be people such as myself, any of the women's groups here or in other countries who are promoting practices or promoting a viewpoint that is contrary to affirming and supporting gender identity. And then the commission that they're seeking to set up will have the power to compel production of documents and the power to compel someone to attend the commission. So you don't have to, but then you will be criminally sanctioned and face up to 3 months in prison if you don't, and fines as well. And also to contravene, there also must have been, take a step back. If we're going to get into the criminal territory and not just the civil penalties, this is where you have to establish that there's been an injury. So if you can establish that someone has suffered an injury, so this could be, say, Women's Place UK, having a position online, and someone says, this has given me a psychiatric injury and I've now got depression because of what I've been reading. That's sort of the logic. So the injury, this is the interesting thing. So this is defined in the Crimes Act in Victoria, and it incorporates sort of actual bodily harm and psychiatric injury. Serious injury is a bit more serious, obviously. There's a definition. Life has been endangered, an injury that is substantial or protracted. However, what the Commission is empowering itself to do is they get to define the definition of what they're saying with serious injury or injury can be defined as a series of incidences that amount to a series of injuries, a serious injury or an injury. Now, under the terms of the legislation, the burden of proof has been reduced in that you don't have to prove all those incidents. You only have to prove one. So they're undermining the burden of proof. You only have to have a partial burden of proof for this crime, which is for any first-year law student, for any person who has any interest in crime at all, would understand that that's just not how it works. It hasn't worked like, it has never worked like that. You cannot devalue the burden of proof in terms of criminality, particularly when the punishment can be up to 10 years in prison and $200,000 in fines. It's extraordinary. I'm absolutely lost for words.
So we've got a bill that is so far unconstitutional, violates the burden of proof, massively overreaches, and then turns spouses into possible criminals for not staying in a contract that's been widely changed. I mean, is there any chance this bill actually gets through? What do you think?
Well, they all seem to be importing themselves and how inclusive they're being. So,
but it's wild. It sounds wild from what you're saying. Like, surely that's the kind of bill that maybe just like it appeases the trans community, but it doesn't get past the first reading. No,
well, I agree with you. And I mean, the other thing is, it incorporates what is corporate, association, unincorporated bodies. So basically, any organisation whatsoever that exists, including those that are just like loose affiliates. So so your online groups of people, and it covers employees, volunteers, agents, and associates of these organisations. So the organisation will be held liable if any of these cohort who have any affiliation whatsoever with the organisation are found to be engaging in suppression practices, contravening the legislation, or perhaps not affirming their family member. And then the corporation will be held liable and fined up to $1 million.
So what is that doing? That's incentivizing companies to keep their people in line, right? Like, so there'll be more control. Yeah, that's really interesting.
And then there's the education piece, actually. So yet another layer where they get to get funding for research. They get to set up the educational materials, and they can go to anybody and impart this education, including these organisations that have been found to have contravened, either by their own actions or by their associates' actions, and they can deliver this education to anyone in the company, including like office holders. So you could have, say, a massive corporation, for example, like Telstra, and you've got someone who's working in their, say, call centre, and they do this. I mean, under the terms of the legislation, this commission could then go to the board of directors of Telstra and educate them.
I know I shouldn't be laughing, but it's just so absurd to me. Like it's like a little 12-year-old sat angrily in the corner scribbling and then just came up with a bill like mum goes to jail and dad it's the most ludicrous, but it's the law, like it's being proposed as a real bill and it's been moved to second reading, right? Like I just
absolutely, yeah. And as I said in hindsight, it's because the people who are pushing this have pretty much written the legislation. It's like, well, what do you want? They've written it down, and they've been
all the women are going, I want all the women in jail. It's like, okay, sure.
And the thing is, you could have people sitting there saying, oh, well, it won't get to that. Like, that's just a ridiculous interpretation. But when you read the legislation down, that is how it works. Yeah. And as we know, they will follow it through to its logical conclusion, and we will have these absurd outcomes.
Yeah.
Do we really have to do that? Do we really have to see this play out in real time with all the, an ordinary person having to go through the fear and hassle and expense of this, possibly losing their job, losing their income, for us to see how ridiculous it is?
Yeah.
Do we really have to follow it through to its logical conclusion, illogical conclusion?
Yeah. Just good
and
to
all
go.
The state resources. I mean, we're putting all these state resources into something that really isn't a problem anymore.
Yeah.
And imagine if we did this for women.
Yeah.
Imagine if women could have a women's commission where, if their spouse engaged in domestic violence or a person sexually harass them or rape them, and they could have this person's corporate employer fined $1 million.
Yeah.
Like, how quickly would domestic violence finish?
Yeah, I think you make you ask such a great question there. So, like, of all the groups in Australia that have a serious claim to being marginalised, Indigenous Australians, battered women, homeless people, like, there's so many groups. Why is this group, the gender identity community, getting a special commission to enforce its ideology against everyone?
I know. It's like, there's this very popular podcast called The Nurse that's just come out of Tasmania. I was listening to it last night, and they were discussing how there seems to be this entrenched covering up of child sexual exploitation in Tasmania in particular. The young journalist who's blowing the whistle on that is doing an outstanding job. And I was listening to the cover-ups that go on in the departments down there and with the Parliament. And I think, why can't the child sex exploitation victims down there get a commission like this?
Yep.
I think it would stop pretty damn quick.
Yeah.
So, but no, they have to go through the normal criminal process where they're often, not always, but where historically the police dismiss them, or a woman showing up like Hannah Clark, making repeated complaints against the person who's stalking and harassing them, and their fears are diminished. They don't have a commission that says, oh yes, we're trauma-informed and victim-led. Yes, we will drag them in and we will drag their companies in and they will be denounced.
Yeah.
Why?
I know.
I mean, that's a real problem.
Yeah.
All these other groups that you've just mentioned as well, this is a real material problem where there are millions of people suffering, and we have this incredibly small cohort on the back of four anecdotal accounts that happened in the past, and they've been given this carte blanche to be judged, jury, and executioner.
So do you have any suspicions about, I guess, just like, what the fuck explains, like, as you say, is it just like, I often hear these cynical explanations like, oh, well, we can't actually do much about child sexual abuse, or we can, but it'll be really expensive and difficult. Oh, so what we'll do is we'll just like pass this birth, deaths and marriages bill because it's super cheap and it'll look like a progressive thing to do for this particular community. Like, is this just another case like that where it's easy and it's cheap but it looks like action, or is there something more complicated going on? Like, what?
I think it's easy political point scoring. I think Australia's probably a bit scarred about how embarrassing the same-sex marriage vote was.
Right.
And people do not want to be on the wrong side of history. And we've been told, oh, this is the civil rights frontier. So people are like, great, I'm on board, without sort of even thinking about it.
Right.
I also think there is the more sinister elements where, there is this push to get the children onto like the hormones and the surgery because there's money to be made. The follow the money argument on the 11th hour blog with Jennifer Barlett. I also think it's laziness.
Yeah.
I don't think some of these, we know that I can imagine MPs are really busy people, but the fact that this legislation appears not to have been read.
Yeah.
Also the media blackout on this.
Yeah. Yeah. We were going to mention that, weren't we? That we've kind of been spending the week pitching these two op-eds, haven't we? And we're just getting like nowhere with the left-wing press, like just kind of rejections and a sort of wall of unwillingness to engage on the issue, or maybe they think it looks, I haven't quite put my finger on whether, are they scared of trans activist pile on Twitter? Are they actually opposed to criticism of the bill because they too make these stupid mistakes and thinking gender identity is just like sexual orientation? Like, I don't really have a good grip on why we can't get any critical discussion through. And you would think in a democracy, we should have healthy opposition. Like, maybe lots of progressives do think this is a good bill, but there are these things to say. And you're like a law graduate and I'm a lecturer. We should be able to write together a thoughtful piece that raises some questions and get that placed. But we can't.
I think it's, they've sort of entrenched themselves. I think it's a whole host of things. So as we know in most of these news outlets, we do have some champions who are trying to fight to get things published, and they're not getting anywhere. I think that there are ideologues
Yeah.
who have been able to control the narrative for a long time. I also think that maybe in Australia, the critical analysis, we just haven't been as organised as in the UK.
Yeah.
We're not as... they seem to be very good at political activism over there. I think particularly in relation to women's rights over here, it's sort of like the noughties and the 90s were a bit of a wasteland for feminism here in this country, and we're just starting to get organised again. So we're sort of trying to play catch up. So I think the general public are aware that there's something going on, but they're not being given a balanced view of what's actually happening because they're only being presented with this side of the argument. So it's creating a bit of an echo chamber.
Yeah.
I think also, yes, there is a bit of a fear of the pylon. We're kind of moving on from that though. I think, like with JKR, she took so much pain for everyone and exposed all of that. But there have been some incidents where the organisations have pushed back, like with, say, Jordan Peterson, when Penguin, the publishers had the town hall meeting and a lot of the younger staff were very upset and they just said, no, we're going to go ahead and publish. And wow, we've gotten great PR for this book. Yeah. Aren't we clever? So I think that, this conversation is not going to go away. And I think that for people in our position, we've just got to keep talking, putting ourselves out there. I think it will eventually, there will come a point where they're going to have to publish the critical analysis because people are going to be asking questions. They're going to be seeking those answers. And, in the beginning, people like you and I might be invited to talk and we'll just be put as the extremist transphobic bigot. But I think when people actually hear what we have to say, we're not like that. We're not hateful, we're not mean, we're just saying we need to have this conversation and here is the problems that we need to maybe discuss.
Yeah. It actually, the media thing here reminds me of the maybe sort of early last year, I think it was in the UK, or maybe even a bit earlier, especially with The Guardian, because I remember there was just virtually no coverage. And it's funny because I had this exchange with one of the contacts there yesterday where I was like, oh, would you consider a piece on this? I think I attached it, and then she was like, oh, we've already covered that, and my colleague wrote this piece about it. And then I looked at it, and the piece was just like, yay, the conversion theory bill. And then there was this sentence that was like, oh, some anti-trans feminists oppose the bill. And it's like, that's us, right? It's like, really? You're the only comprehensible way to understand such feminists is because they're anti-trans. It's like, so they clearly have no grip on what the sensible opposition could be, like all the stuff we've been talking about here. So, and I often find that I get asked, well, what's the solution here? How do you include the trans people? I'm like, look, they are very valid questions, but I'm like, I don't actually have all the answers, and I shouldn't be sitting here speaking for the other side either. I think that we need to have these debates so everyone gets to have their turn. And then the public can decide for themselves. And maybe it might turn out in 10 years' time, I hope not, but I'm wrong and the public wants to go with that point of view, then at least we've had the debate. I agree. But we can't be doing all this without having the proper debate and without having all the information out there for the general public to make up their own mind. Yeah, I agree. I think I totally agree with you about that. I would be so much happier if we could just make our points, state the opposition, and watch a conversation unfold. I'm going to fight, I'll be unhappy about this if we don't triumph in the court of public opinion, and I'll probably keep arguing about it till my death, right? But I'm happy to defer to a democratic process. What I'm not happy to do is be blacked out or muzzled in some way where the argument is being won because our side is just not being heard.
That's a colonisation. I mean,
it's not democracy.
I would love to have this argument with someone from the other side. We talk amongst ourselves all the time. I know, Holly, you're really good in some of the debates of being the devil's advocate. I would love to be challenged on my ideas. I'd really love to have it out with someone who's, as entrenched in their position as I sort of. From my side, I think that'd be great entertainment for everyone, and we could really start testing these ideas and trying to find a way forward.
Totally, I would love that too. I agree, but it's virtually impossible because they are currently still in the state of just no platforming or not being co-platformed with anyone who has views like ours, critical views.
Because we always talk to each other and we agree mostly, and it's like, I'd really love someone to challenge my ideas, and maybe I am holding a position that might be a bit wrong. Maybe I haven't considered something, and fair enough, and maybe that will open my eyes to things a bit more, and I'm willing to take that on, as I think you are. So
let's hope. I mean, I guess we just have to hope we get some publicity, and eventually what happened in the UK starts happening in Australia. That's got to be the hope, and just that things are not, like, as we've talked about before, that not too many people get hurt before that happens, right? That's the worry.
Well, I'd love to see one of us on Breakfast TV. Like, when we saw Posey Parker on Breakfast TV, I'm like, I think we've made it to the mainstream.
That's true. We need our Adrian Harrop and our Adrian Harrop v Posey moment.
And we need our Piers Morgan throwing bombs just to clear up the argument.
We need you being like, it's Mrs. Deves, actually. Or Doctor, it's Doctor,
Right. The Dr. Lawford-Smith, thank you.
That'd be amazing. Oh, well, here's hoping. Thank you so much for talking to me about this. This has been really helpful. Is there anything else you want to add on before we leave it? Have we missed anything?
No, not really. I mean, just if anyone's watching and they're curious, we've got groups online. Holly, you have a presence. We've got Save Women's Sports Australasia that can help you find a whole lot of other women's groups that often talk to each other. So I'm not sure. Maybe we could post a list on Save Women's Sports Australasia of the women's groups in Australia. So who are and not just women's groups, but just general groups. Some of these groups really do transcend bipartisanship, and we welcome men in some of the groups. It's not just all women, and just get involved. So I'm talking about educating yourself, but start forming your own opinion.
Getting educated.
And maybe there might be some suggestions as to how you can get involved if you want to.
Good. Okay, I'll put that in the description too. So just at least the first go-to place to hook you up to all the other go-to places.
Get out there and educate yourself.
The TRA mantra. Okay, thank you so much. This has been great.
Thanks so much, Holly.
Bye.
Okay, bye.